So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is our great pleasure to host you all today in this session of the Decolonial Voice Series. We are happy to have participants joining us from different parts of the world. And today we are honored to be joined by Professor Anne Norton, who is Distinguished Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of several books, notably Wild Democracy, Courage, Anarchy, Courage and Ruling the Law, and also on the Muslim question by Princeton University Press. She is a founding co-editor of Theory and Event and has served on the editorial boards of several journals, including Political Theory and Reorient. She has also taught at University of Chicago, University of Notre Dame, Princeton University, and University of Texas, and has held fellowships at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton and the Institute for Advanced Studies. She was educated at University of Chicago. Our guest today is also scientific committee member of the World Decolonization Forum, which is initiated by Institute Social and will be organized on 11th and 12th of May in Istanbul Atatürk Cultural Center. So this year's theme is Decolonizing Knowledge Production and Circulation. Professor Anne, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Iden. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
It's our pleasure. So before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce the purpose of the Decolonial Voice Series. This initiative aims to bring together leading scholars from diverse disciplines to deepen the discourse on decolonial thought. Specifically, we seek to contextualize emerging discussions on the decolonial consensus, or perhaps the decolonizing the consensus, by comparing them with other global frameworks. So while the Washington and Beijing consensus are well established, and we are now witnessing the emergence of new paradigms in the world, which is also practically forced by the countries to have new consensus in the world. But at the same time, recently, a couple of months ago, scholars from the Western countries have published London Consensus by the London Schools of Economy, which focuses on the social resilience within the capitalist system. And also, in Institute Social, we had several roundtables, decolonial roundtables, and we discussed the possibility of the global consensus, or what is the situation in the world. So we ended up with the concept of the Tel Aviv consensus, which inspires the rest of the world for the recolonization back to 19th century controversies. And at the same time, there are also prioritizing security-oriented foreign policies. And as we witness in Ukraine-Russian war, so these kind of policies are also very much inspired from the Moscow consensus, as we may also identify. So among these competing frameworks, our objective is to explore the utopias, maybe, of the non-Western world, and also including Western world as well. And like Professor Anne from the Western world, who is contributing to global understanding and criticizing the colonial history, colonial approaches in theory. So can we revive the decolonization and spirit of the, let's say, the 1960s, 50s Bandung Conference, or should we also discuss more about decolonization to empower the anti-colonial movements as well? So, dear Professor Norton, you have written extensively on pluralism, democracy, and interaction of the Western and non-Western political thought. To begin with recent developments, concepts such as democracy, pluralism, liberalism have long dominated the discourse of the world politics, with the United States acting as their primary architect and advocate, often justifying interventionism through all these concepts. However, we have reached a critical juncture where the United States itself appears to have abandoned these very principles of the world order. This raises a fundamental question. Has the vast body of academic literature and conceptual frameworks built around these values become obsolete and irrelevant? Floor is yours.
I hope that those values are not irrelevant. But I think for a long time, really since the anti-colonial movements of the 1950s and 60s, there has been, especially coming from the non-West, a very powerful critique of the West's recognition and institutionalization of those values. Um, I mean, the 1960s in the United States was a time of arguing, I think quite correctly, that democracy had not been fully established there, and that the West needed to commit to democracy and could learn from those anti-colonial movements. I mean, in many ways, those were the first political texts that I read as a child, an older child, and they were very inspiring because that was where you saw democracy coming into being. That was where you saw uh, intellectual and epistemological challenges being set against the West. And it was also different approaches. So instead of a single uniform imperial center, with common institutions across diverse countries, you would now see different styles of intellectual life, different institutions, different approaches to democracy. And that had a very powerful influence, I think, in the academy and to a lesser but significant extent in politics. And I think that was in the United States. Around the world, I think it was even more powerful.
I see. And it seems the work is regressing into 19th century power politics. So if the guarantor of the rules-based order and no longer follows the rules, the global system is left in a vacuum. So who will step in and what comes next? And maybe we have to critically analyze the recent developments. Maybe democracy wasn't there. Maybe it was not a rules-based order. So how do you analyze all this process?
It's an extremely interesting question because as one watches the news, particularly here in the United States, the sense that we are regressing to the 19th century is a very powerful one. The brutality of 19th century imperialism is fully on view in the American intervention with Israel against Iran. I mean, that is a simple assertion of brutal 19th century power. It's also an assertion that bears the hallmarks of the discourse and rhetoric of that period, so that the claim is always, oh, we are freeing you from something. With Saddam Hussein, we are freeing you from dictatorship. Often the claim is we are freeing women. Uh, that that justifying discourse is very powerful again. We're freeing Tehran from theocratic rule. At the very same time, when one sees a imperialist Christian nationalism in the United States, theocratic rule is our problem now. And so in that sense, it's quite reminiscent of 19th century imperialism. And I would underline the brutality. But it's different in another sense. And the difference is, I think, interesting. It's intensified because everything moves faster now. People communicate very rapidly. They can communicate uh, through a more geographically extensive region. The speed is faster. So that intensification alters the character. And one one salutary result is that Americans and people throughout the West have access to the critical thought of people in other countries and the influence of that thought, particularly in my experience from Africa and the Middle East, well, in Latin America, is very important. So that is a difference that is a good difference.
Does it change anything, Professor?
Yes, it cha I how much it will change institutions remains to be seen. it is unquestionably breaking things open, I think, in the old imperial centers in Britain, in France, in the United States. But I don't know. I mean, in the United States, we wonder every day if we're going to wake up and find tanks in the streets. So um, one cannot have too much hope, but I think that the hope there is comes from decolonizing influences that imported from abroad intellectually, but also the activities of uh, imperial populations dominated by imperialism here, so that the indigenous Muslim immigrants and also long-standing Muslims in the United States. That is where progressive politics is coming from in the United States. That's fascinating. So new things are being born, but how much fruit they will bear remains to be seen. But I was interested in your question about the rules-based order. I am one of those people who doesn't really believe there ever was a rules-based order. Too much power, too much brutality of power. Um, but I do agree um, that there is a challenge to American hegemony, and nothing could be better. Well, I don't, it's the American hegemony has not been good for the world, and it has not been good for America. It has been profoundly destructive, and I would love to see that broken open. But I hope it will not be broken open simply to be replaced by another hegemonic power. That's not good. That's just imperialism in a different key. But rather something that makes possible the emergence of multiple styles of thought, styles of governance, centers of power, and because it is through those that you get radically changed learning, that you get a kind of openness to new ways of being a Democrat, because that has rarely been achieved. Most of us live in places, if we are lucky, where there is some democracy and some openness to other forms of thought. And the more we have of that, the better.
Yeah, so Professor, of course, it's quite clear that you are from the beginning very much critical to that American hegemony, which also questions the rules, the definition of the rules-based order. And you highlighted that the West itself is very much open to non-Western ideas and thought, maybe last several decades. So my question would be more about that concept, because so how would you define a decolonial approach to political theory? For example, as a political scientist, I should explain to my students that classical political science is a Western political science, and they need to learn it because they mainly communicate with that world, and the international media speaks through that language and concepts, and global politics itself is very much based on these.
I think this is frozen.
I think it's an internet problem.
Yes, good. I'm glad
Yeah.
it's not just me. I thought, oh my God. Usually,
Seljuk should be back soon, yes.
yes, it usually comes back. Inshallah.
Maybe we can ask the question of Selçuk Hoca, you know. Huh. He's back. He's back. Okay. Please keep asking your questions, Selçuk Hoca.
Hocam, you are muted.
sorry for that. So first of all, sorry for this connection. Give me a few minutes. I should do some, yeah. So, Professor, as we spoke on the concepts about the non-Western thought, how it influenced and shaped the Western world as well, which is quite new development at the same time. So, how would you define a decolonial approach to political theory and political science? Because I also experienced this process in my university because I'm teaching introduction to political science in university, and also I always explain to students that classical political science is a Western political science, and at the same time they need to learn it because they mainly communicate with that world, Western world, and the international media speaks that language, and global politics itself is very much based on these concepts. But the reality is very much different here in Turkey and non-Western world as well. So here are we going to establish, how are we going to establish the plurality you refer to in all your work within political science if the structure itself has been built this way?
I think that this is fundamentally a dialectical process because on the one hand, you're absolutely right. And I tell my students the same thing, that this is not the whole of political thought. This is a particular body of political theory that has been privileged and established in the West. But one of the great ironies is it's not even the West. It's fundamentally Germany with a bit of France, a bit of the UK, and a little bit of Italy. Almost no Spanish thought, no Scandinavian thought whatsoever. So it's a very tiny West. And that tiny West, it has been incredibly, that is what the canon is, with the Greeks, of course, but only up to a certain point, then no more Greeks. So that is the core that my students still have to learn, but it's not enough. And it's not enough in really important ways. Students have to learn to look critically at this to say, why are there these parameters? And also, one of the questions that's important to me is these people, the core of the traditional Western canon, they are not Democrats. They are certainly not anarchists. They are very conservative, very limited people who, for the most part, Plato and Aristotle on, are the servants of tyrants. That's what they did for a living. And that we need to be conscious of that and how it has limited that thought. But we also need to recognize that that thought was in many ways in dialogue with non-Western thought. So that you get, for example, the Greeks were lost to the West until Muslim thinkers brought them back. And if it were not for Muslim philosophy, there would be no Greeks in Western political thought, which is where we see our thought is founded in the West. So you have to know that origin story and that story of engagement that has been erased. It has to be restored so that we understand the lineage of the Western canon, but also that we recognize that it's much of it, the things we value in it, came from another tradition. There is one more thing it does, and oddly enough, it returned in many ways to the United States from a very conservative theorist, a man named Leo Strauss, who was trained in Germany. And Strauss argued in some early works that the problem with Western philosophy was that we didn't read very well. We were bad at interpreting texts and that we studied in an artificial fashion. And what we should do is employ the methods that are shown in Muslim and Jewish texts. We should learn to learn as others did. And so that methodological insight is quite important too. It's not just that when you read other theorists, you find out different, for example, different constitutional theories. One of the things that my students loved, somewhat to my surprise, when we read the late Ayatollah Khomeini's constitutional theory, they loved it. It was familiar to them because it was a constitutional theory and they knew where they were with it. So they found those ideas quite engaging. And it gave them a critical perspective on their own governmental institutions. It enabled them to recognize that figures that are presented to them as terrorists were thinkers. And so it was good.
Professor, so I like when you mention about Ayatollah Khomeini's book on state and constitution. So we can give multiple examples as well for let's say the Western students as well to read non-Western thinkers, even the statesmen. So do you think if we raise this kind of consciousness in the West, is it going to change something?
Yes, I do think it changes things. And it changes them in expected and unexpected ways. I mean, the expected ways are, which are important, are that they learn things they didn't know before. They learn content. They learn where things come from. They learn the content of other modes of thought. That's useful. Sometimes they learn how to interpret a text differently. Also good. The thing they learn that is, I think, very subtle but very important is that they learn to break out of their state and cultural boundaries. And I think this because a long time ago, I was teaching a course on Muslim political thought. And I had a very diverse group of students. And and I showed them a film at some point. It was Yusuf Shaheen's Destiny. And a big part of that film is the way in which the texts of Ibn Rushd are transmitted into France. And it takes this young man goes to study with Ibn Rushd. He takes texts back. He loses them. He has to return again. And what was important about that was the recognition that there was engagement with other cultures. Part of it was the struggle to find the new, to find the other. But what struck me was at the end of that film, one of my students who was Polish, Catholic, took my hand, kissed my hand, and said, "Thank you for showing me this." And I was really stunned. But I realized that part of what was important for him was that it wasn't just that there were other traditions and cultures in the world, other politics. It was that they could belong to him. That in learning these things, it was no different than when he learned Plato or when he learned Rousseau. That these two could be his texts that shaped his mind and became part of his intellectual formation. So that was unexpected to me, but I think it is a very valuable thing that happens to people.
Good. And Professor, normally I had this question. I think you indeed saliently replied it, but I think we should extend examples as well, because that's why I want to ask again that question. Because because I prepared that question, turning to practice, what are some concrete steps scholars and universities can take to decolonize political theory, political science, and the study of the concepts like a democracy, liberalism, especially in curriculums shaped by Western frameworks? So can you give more examples? Because we are incredibly enthusiastic to listen to these kind of examples.
It is fundamentally a concrete project. It has to be a practical project, not just an intellectual one. And I think there are two things that have to happen to canonical political theory. One is the canon has to change, More people have to be included. I mean, frankly, for simply intellectual reasons, when you take out all the medieval thinkers in particular, mostly from the Muslim world, who influenced thinkers in the West, you're doing intellectual violence to both traditions. So the canon has to change. And also, we have to recognize, as I said before, that these people in the traditional Western canon, they were not where democracy came from. They were the people who tried to hold democracy back. And that's an important thing to recognize about that canon. That canon's not a canon of democracy. It's a canon for the prevention of democracy. And so they need to understand that about their own tradition. So they have to look critically at the canon. They have to insist on the presence of multiple traditions in the canon, because that was how it happened. That's the actual intellectual lineage. That needs to be made visible to them. But I think they also need access to these traditions. They need to be able to study Muslim political thought. When I first came to Penn, it was impossible. And at first the first year I said, I don't have enough Arabic, I don't have Turkish, I don't have the languages for this. And then I thought, you don't have ancient Greek either, but you teach Plato. That we need to not regard this in an Orientalist frame. It's not something that has to remain pure and different and inscrutable to us. It has to be, we have to have more and better translations. We do have to have more and better professors who speak those languages, but we also have to make it accessible to people, to give them courses in African political thought, Muslim political thought, and have these engage with each other. So those two things, make the canon bigger, make the canon more representative of its own history, enable people to interrogate the canon, but insist on the presence and intellectual integrity of other traditions, make them accessible to people. What else? Escape the Orientalist frame that says, oh, we can only have Westerners teaching the West and Muslims teaching Islam. And it's not an ethnic question. It's an intellectual question. So those are some concrete steps, and I'm sure there are more.
Yeah, thank you. And also, like you are you are working on studying on political theory, and mostly your whole career is on the political science and theories. But at the same time, how these kind of theoretical questions are shaping the real world and in relation to colonization. Do you think is it still relevant to the concept of the colonization?
Oh, yes. And colonialism is and anti-colonial thought, colonial thought, anti-colonial thought, decolonization. Those are things that I have also taught my whole life because I grew up watching them, not because they were really happening around me, but because they were fairly recent and they were so hopeful. So I have always found those really important. And I honestly, I don't see how anyone who looks at the West now can fail to be conscious of the importance of settler colonialism in the West. For the British and French, it's the establishment of settler colonies. For the United States and Canada and Latin America, it's being a settler colony. And for Algerians too. So there is this necessity and the way that the world forces itself on you, where you say, this is, if I look clearly at this, I cannot fail to see the effects and the presence of colonialism. And there are political movements throughout the world, especially from indigenous groups in Palestine, to be sure, but also in Australia and New Zealand and Latin America and North America, who insist upon the recognition of settler colonialism. And not just as conquest or brutality, but also as the erasure of some alternative ways of thinking that are, I believe, profoundly important.
Thank you. And this is my last question, Professor, and then we are going to start the Q&A part. Our participants can ask their questions, and we have our distinguished scientific committee members here with us. I'm sure they have several questions. So my last question is about decolonial consensus, as I mentioned in the beginning of my speech. So more broadly speaking, do you think there is a room for a decolonial consensus, or should we rather speak of the decolonizing the consensus concept itself? Do you think there is also possibility finding a common ground in the world as well? And do you think this proposition should come from the non-Western world? Because do you think non-Western world should be the subject or again object of all these conceptual propositions? Thank you.
It has come from the non-Western world in 2 or 3 respects. I mean, it's come from the non-Western world in the demonstration of opposition to colonial regimes and to that, what we call the imperial legacy, in particular of ideas of property, ideas of law, and ideas of the ethno-state. So that has already happened or is already happening. I like the idea, I prefer the idea of decolonizing the consensus because I'm uneasy with consensus. This is my anarchist streak. What I like best about decolonizing the consensus is that it's too soon to have a consensus. What we need to do is break things open and look at ideas that are unfamiliar to us. Look at ways of being democratic, being anarchist, being having something other than the state or the state as we understand it in the West, and come to understand those. And then I think it is possible while doing this to find common ground. But I think the common ground may be different at different sites. Like some scholars, some traditions, some people may agree about ideas of property. Some people may agree about the democratic or more anarchist models. They don't all need to agree about everything. The presence of difference, the presence of different models, different ways of thinking, we need to accept a little chaos. A little chaos is very good for thought.
Yeah, chaos might be good for the thought, but not for the real world. So still, I think the common ground would be for the peace, which we need a lot right now in the world politics as well. So, and thank you for the contribution, Professor. And I think your perspective is quite significant, crucial, and relevant to contemporary developments as well. So, floor is for our distinguished participants. So either they can ask directly or they can write in question box so I can read their question. So we have here Professor Salman, so here Professor Adrian Harewood, Professor Fırat Oruç, Professor Alexis Wick, and Dr. İpek Coşkun Arman, who are our distinguished member of the scientific committee. So if you have any question, please, you can directly ask your question. it looks like, Professor, your answer clearly clarified their mind, so they don't have any question.
No, Professor Armayan had a question earlier. I remember.
Okay.
Oh,
What is
yeah.
it?
Someone has a question here.
Okay, yeah, someone can ask directly. Yeah, he's here, but yeah.
Yeah,
There we are.
I'd like to ask, this is someone said, I'd like to ask Professor Norton. She talks a lot about, and she has in her work, describes herself as an anarchist, or at least have anarchistic elements around her thinking around it. But towards the end, and you picked up on this, Selçuk, she started talking a little bit more about how it's necessary to bring about chaos, etc. And I wanted to know whether or how she tied up her anarchism with the kind of revolutionary zeal for transforming the world. Is she an anarchist or a Maoist?
Was quite an admirer of Mao in my childhood, because of the redistributive power of that early activity. But I am in no way a late Maoist or a Stalinist because, like you, I distrust the state and particularly the ethno-state. So there is that. I think, and what I admire about anarchism is its openness, its emphasis on the commons, which I think is a very important ground for engagement with indigenous traditions, and its willingness to allow difference, to allow people to be different, institutions to be different, and to contest with repressive institutions. What I dislike about it is, or what I'm anxious about in it is that some people read anarchism as being sort of everyone for themselves. And I read anarchism through the lens of Ibn Khaldun, that uh, self-reliance is a good, independence is a good, but that actually enables you to have greater solidarity with others and to work together more effectively. So technically, if we were in the 19th century, I'd be an anarcho-syndicalist or something, but it doesn't, I think all this is all too precious. And it is the power of radical diversity that I most admire and that I'm looking for in that.
Thank you. So, Volkan Hocam, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, if I'm not mistaken, you said that the consensus, the contribution has already come from the East. The idea of law, the idea of property. Can you elaborate that a little bit, or maybe an example, a sample from what do you mean by that exactly? Thank you very much.
Yes, when I say that the decolonial consensus is coming, or the challenge to the old colonial institutions and regime has come from the East, I am thinking of the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century and that continue. I have in mind indigenous challenges to ideas of property. People like Glenn Coulthard in Canada, Rob Nichols in the United States, but and multiple indigenous thinkers in New Zealand and Australia. And the way in which they prompt us to think about property as being something other than private property or property owned by the state. There are other models. And New Zealand has even written some of this into law, which is interesting. So that's a form of decolonization that is, and undoing colonialism that's important. I think that the question of law and constitutionalism has really been an essential element of, I'll call it using your phrase, it has been the challenge from the East. And I'm thinking of Max Weber and the way that Max Weber wrote about systems of law in the Muslim world and systems of law in the West, in Europe, really. And that the fact that there were different ways of doing justice had a big effect on American thought at the intellectual level, not so much at the practical level. So that's what I meant by these things coming from the East. And I think now the question of Palestine has broken open thought in parts of the West, particularly, well, actually in Europe broadly, in the United States very powerfully, that it makes imperial domination and settler colonialism visible for people, and that has opened the debate, both in practical political terms and intellectually. Is that clear?
Yes, I understood. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and also I have another question, Professor, because in your On the Muslim question, the book, you also highlighted that how the Western thinkers and let's say the knowledge production process portrayed Muslims as let's say, incompatible with the democracy and quite relevant to patriarchal and authoritarian system. But you also highlighted in your speech how Muslims contributed to Western political thought as well. So can you also explain why Western world is portraying Muslims like that? And what is the end game through all this misleading representation of the Muslims?
When I wrote the book, I was mostly struck by the irony that the things that were these issues that were presented to the Westerners as being problems that Muslims had, that Muslims brought, that Muslims made for us, were all problems that the West already had, and in many respects had more fully than the Muslims who were being criticized. And there is a phrase in contemporary American politics: every accusation is a confession. And I think that is really true of the discourse about Muslims in the West, that all the things that are supposed to be a problem, like, oh, Muslims don't believe in freedom of speech. Well, who's repressing freedom of speech? That is something you have to look in the mirror for in the West. Or Muslims are repressive of women. And you're going, and have you looked at your legal system recently? Or in the United States, I used to point out to my students that Iran had more representation of women in the legislature than the United States did. And so that there was a kind of unconscious self-criticism there, but what I wanted to do was make it visible to people.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have another participant whose name is Nevzat. Dr. Nevzat, you can ask directly your question. And please introduce yourself.
I think maybe mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the Social Institute and Dr. Norton for amazing topic, which I have been writing a book about decolonization on my thought, and a friend of mine. I would like to ask, to free us the world from Eurocentric colonial thought. I think one must first question how the world has been named, classified, and whose knowledge has been recognized as a, universal, which is not. The issue is not merely colonialism as a phenomenon of the past. It's, I think, also a mindset that continues to live today in our language education, in our academia, even, diplomatic language. in the media, art, economy, and also international institute. So my question to you, how then, after all this colonialized mindset and education, can we reimagine global political and epistemic structure beyond the Eurocentric colonial frameworks? And where we have to start? Thank you.
I am, in some respects, a political romantic. So my impulse is to say, yes, we can. We are. But I recognize, I think with you, that this is uh, a vast project.
Yeah.
The way in which colonialism and Orientalism, Eurocentrism embedded themselves, especially in things like our language, our classification systems, that will be extraordinarily hard to undo. I still think it can be done, and I think the mindset can be done. It is possible for people to it is possible for people to think differently and to think differently about pervasive structures like our property system. You rightly distinguished economics as being one of the central sites of Eurocentrism. And I think it is one of the most troublesome, dominating, hegemonic systems. Undoing that is going to be difficult because it is institutionally as well as enshrined as well as in our minds. But I think I think you pointed out perhaps the way it can most effectively be approached at the outset. And that is the whole question of classification. What do we name things? How do we classify them? What work do those classifications do, and how can we address them critically in order to undo them? So I think your question points to both the enormity of the problem and perhaps a critical juncture or a technique that we can use to address it.
Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Nevzat Çelik, as Dr. Selçuk I didn't say. I am associated professor in Sciences Po in Paris, and which I am interested because it's really, I have been living in France more than 15 years. And I think, I would, blame British and France to have all this topic, and when it comes to question of colonialism. And thank you. I'm very happy to hear all this amazing information from you. And thanks again for the
Thank
social.
you, Dr. Nevzat. And also we have last question, Professor Norton. So our last question from the Professor Fırat Oruç from Georgetown Qatar University. And he basically says, building on Selçuk's question and with you and Salman here, we recently had the Islamophobia conference in Doha and are about to convene the Decolonization Forum in Istanbul. Could you flesh out a bit more how decolonial theory intersect with what Salman described as undoing Islamophobia? I'm not sure that decolonial thinkers and critics of Islamophobia have yet established a sustained conversation, at least not so far, and I would be interested in your thoughts on whether and how such a dialogue might be developed.
Just a moment of clarification. The dialogue on the dismantling or deconstruction of
How it should be
Islamophobia.
developed, how it might be and should be developed. Yeah.
I think you are. I mean, I found that I look at what is happening intellectually in the world. I mean, there these Islamophobia conferences are incredible. They have been very illuminating to me, but also clearly they attract many scholars and produce work that is then read by many more people. I think the emergence of the question of decolonization, the network of readers that activities like Reorient produce, that this is happening. It is one of the things that is disturbing to me is the way in which intellectuals in the West, especially, I have to say, in political theory, turn their faces away. These are topics that they don't really want to consider. Or if they want to consider this, they are still wedded to an idea of assimilation so that you, whether you are a member of some other ethnic, religious, or other minority or an ally, that you can be included, but only on their terms. And I think I think the emergence of conferences where the presumption where the classifications have been decolonized, as Dr. Nizat pointed out, where the presumption is that people understand that there is Islamophobia, that they have a certain basic knowledge of Islam, that they have some knowledge of anti-colonial activities politically and intellectually, that these are presumptions now, and presumptions at certain sites so that more work can be done. And the emphasis is not on seeking inclusion in a Western model, but rather in presenting different, altered, to some extent, already decolonized models. And it's good to hear from you again. I remember you from Doha.
Yeah. And currently he's in Istanbul because of the recent developments. Yeah. And thank you, Professor. And thank you also how you appreciate our initiative as well. You say that we are doing together as you are a member of our scientific committee. And we have many members here in that meeting as well. And thank you for attending and contributing that conversation. And hopefully our speech are going to reach more people, to reach more audience, and to raise the awareness on these kind of topics. Thank you again, Professor, and thank you for all participants who join us and contribute that meeting. Have a wonderful day for all
Thank you,
participants and
Dr. Aydin,
professors.
and all of
Thank
you.
you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.